Born of a language the enemy couldn't break. How an ancient tongue, once suppressed at boarding schools, became America's most unshakable shield in the Pacific. War stories often begin with the roar of artillery or the crack of rifles, but this one begins with a language, older than the United States itself, shaped by desert winds, carried by generations of storytellers, and nearly silenced by the government that would one day depend on it for survival. It begins with a whisper in Navajo. The Pacific in 1942 was a place where messages died before they reached their destination. Radios crackled with confusion. Japanese code breakers intercepted transmissions within minutes, and entire operations collapsed because orders arrived too late or were deciphered too easily. American commanders faced a terrifying truth: no strategy, no firepower, no courage could win a war if the enemy always knew the plan. And then, somewhere far from the coral beaches of the Pacific, in the high desert mesas of the Navajo Nation, an idea sparked, one that sounded improbable, even outlandish, one that would change the course of the war. Long before Pearl Harbor, long before the Marines began recruiting on Navajo land, America had tried to erase the very tool it now needed for survival. Navajo children were taken from their homes and sent to government boarding schools where speaking their language brought punishment, soap in the mouth, beatings, isolation. Teachers insisted that English was the future and that Navajo was a barrier to progress. But the children remembered anyway. In secret corners of dormitories, behind barns, out on windswept playgrounds, they whispered Navajo words to one another, holding on to their identity one syllable at a time. Those whispered words would one day save thousands of American lives. When the Marines finally stepped on Navajo land in 1942, the tribal elders listened carefully. For generations, the Navajo had fought to survive government policies that targeted their culture. Yet when recruiters explained the stakes of the coming war, how Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, how the very freedom of the world hung in the balance, the elders understood something deeper. The Navajo people had always stood for defense, resilience, and protection. And so, they agreed. Young Navajo men, some barely out of boarding school, others hardened by life on the reservation, lined up to enlist. Many had never traveled beyond their homeland, some had never seen the ocean, but each carried something more powerful than a rifle, a language the enemy could not possibly understand. Boot camp was a shock. Gunnery sergeants barked orders at blistering speed, and Navajo recruits who had grown up tending sheep or riding horses across canyonlands suddenly found themselves doing push-ups in red Arizona dust. But they adapted quickly. Discipline was nothing new. They had endured stricter, colder authority in the boarding schools. What the Marines saw were recruits who followed orders instantly, learned fast, and refused to back down. But the real work began after boot camp. 29 Navajo Marines, later known as the original Code Talkers, were taken to a secure room and handed a mission so secret that even their fellow Marines could not know it. They were to create a code based on Navajo. Not a simple word substitution, not a fragile cipher, but a living, breathing communication system that could move faster than any machine and remain unbreakable even under fire. At first, the task seemed impossible. Navajo had no words for submarine, grenade, or machine gun, so they created them. A submarine became iron fish. A tank became turtle. A bomber plane became buzzard. All rooted in the imagery of their culture, all easy for a Navajo speaker to understand and impossible for anyone else to decipher. Then they took it further. They created an alphabet. They created variants. They made the code flexible, fast, adaptable. By the time they finished, the Marines had in their hands something no nation on Earth possessed: a fully developed spoken code that could never be cracked. The first test came quickly. A coded message sent in Navajo was delivered, translated, and decoded in under 20 seconds. Military code machines took hours. The Marine Corps made its decision: send them to war. The Pacific greeted the Code Talkers with the thunder of artillery. On Guadalcanal, the first group of Navajo Marines landed in a nightmare: thick jungle, constant rain, and an enemy known for ambushes. But the Code Talkers set up their radios and began transmitting messages at lightning speed. Commanders expected errors. There were none. They expected delays. There were none. For the first time since the war began, American forces moved with clear, secure communication. Orders flowed like water, fluid, precise, unstoppable. Every word sent in Navajo was a blade turned against the enemy. The Japanese intercepted every transmission. They heard the Code Talkers' voices on the radio. They recorded them, analyzed them, studied them. And yet, the meaning remained locked away. One Japanese officer later admitted that it sounded like nothing on Earth, not even human, he said, more like a windstorm speaking. The windstorm grew stronger. By the time the Marines reached Tarawa and Bougainville, the Code Talkers were no longer a novelty. They were a necessity. Messages passed through their lips, guided artillery fire, redirected reinforcements, and saved entire platoons from being wiped out. Commanders reported that Navajo-coded messages cut communication times by over 98%. At Iwo Jima, the Code Talkers proved their worth beyond all doubt. During the first 48 hours of the invasion, they sent more than 800 messages without a single error. Their speed and accuracy were so legendary that Major Howard Connor later declared, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." That statement was no exaggeration. The enemy was fierce, the terrain was hell, and yet the Navajo Code Talkers, hidden behind rocks, crouched in shell holes, radio packs strapped to their backs, kept the entire operation connected. Their words carried the battle forward. And still, the Code Talkers could tell no one. When the war ended, the men returned home not as celebrated heroes, but as silent ones. The code remained classified. Their contribution, one of the most decisive in the Pacific, was buried under secrecy. Families asked about the war. The Code Talkers changed the subject. Medals? None. Public recognition? None. Many returned to a nation that did not yet fully understand or respect their identity. Some faced discrimination as severe as what they'd known before the war. But they carried themselves with quiet dignity. After all, they had helped win one of the greatest conflicts in human history. They knew the truth, even if the world did not. The code they had created, the one based on a language once forbidden in schools, remained unbroken, undefeated, unchallenged. It had saved America, and no one, no.
Decades passed before the government finally declassified the Navajo Code. When the truth came out, historians were stunned. Cryptographers marveled. Military experts called it one of the most brilliant innovations of World War II, and the nation listened. At last, the Code Talkers received the recognition they deserved. Honors poured in, medals were awarded, presidents spoke their names. The world learned that victory in the Pacific had not just been won by firepower or strategy, but by a language older than the war, older than the country, older than the conflict that had nearly consumed the world. A language once whispered in secret dormitories, carried nervously past stern teachers, nearly erased by policy, and yet powerful enough to secure freedom across an entire ocean. Today, when historians tell the story of World War II, they speak of aircraft carriers, island invasions, and generals. But the tale of the Navajo Code Talkers stands apart. It is not just a war story. It is a story of survival, of resilience, of culture, of a people who protected the very nation that had once tried to silence them. Most of all, it is the story of a language born from the earth, woven from tradition, and sharpened into a weapon no enemy could break. A language that carried the United States to victory. A language spoken today with pride, honored forever as the code that saved countless lives. A language not born for war, but reborn because war demanded something unbreakable. And it found that strength in Navajo. Warriors turned messengers of lightning speed. Young Navajo Marines trained to send battlefield codes faster than any machine, accuracy measured in heartbeats. War begins with noise, gunfire, explosions, the metallic scream of machinery. But sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is a whisper, carried through static, spoken by a young Marine with the radio on his back and a code inside his mind that no machine, no enemy, no empire can break. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers. Warriors turned messengers, their speed measured not by technology, but by instinct, memory, and heartbeat. When the United States Marine Corps first arrived on Navajo land in 1942, few could imagine that the future of the Pacific War would hinge on the voices of young men who had grown up herding sheep, riding horses, and learning their tribe's ancient oral traditions. Fewer still could imagine that their language, a language outsiders had once tried to suppress, would soon move faster across battlefields than any encryption machine the world had ever seen. But war has a way of changing the value of things, and suddenly the Navajo language was priceless. The making of lightning-fast messengers. Boot camp at Camp Pendleton was a heat-soaked blur of sweat, shouts, and relentless drills. Navajo recruits, many barely 18 years old, woke before dawn, marched for miles, memorized weapon drills, and endured training that left their legs shaking and their lungs burning. But the Navajo were used to endurance. Their ancestors had survived the long walk, starvation, and forced relocation. Compared to that, Marine Corps training was harsh, but familiar in spirit. Still, nothing prepared them for the room they were eventually taken to. A secured, guarded space, where they met the 29 original Code Talkers. Inside, they learned that they were not just Marines. They were going to become messengers. Not ordinary radio men, but the fastest, most accurate communicators in military history. Their instructors explained the stakes. American codes were being broken within hours by Japanese cryptographers. Lives were being lost. Entire operations were compromised. The U.S. needed a code that the enemy could not decipher, one that could be sent and received faster than any device on Earth. And so, the Navajo recruits learned a new kind of warfare. Not with rifles, not with bayonets, but with syllables. Training the mind for battle. They memorized a code built on their language, over 400 terms. Aircraft became birds, bombs became eggs, battalions became clans. The world of war was reimagined through Navajo metaphors, forming a code so complex and fluid that even fluent speakers could not understand it without training. They practiced under pressure, timed drills, simulated attacks, blinding smoke screens, explosions so loud they rattled bones. In these moments, they had seconds, sometimes less, to receive, translate, encode, transmit, and decode messages. Mistakes were unforgivable. The wrong word could send artillery fire crashing down on friendly forces. Accuracy meant survival. Speed meant victory. Soon they could send a 3-line message in 20 seconds, faster than the fastest encryption machines by several minutes. Their minds became precision instruments. Their tongues moved with instinctive certainty. Warriors became messengers. Messengers became lightning. The first test, Guadalcanal. When the Code Talkers deployed to Guadalcanal, reality struck hard and fast. Rain fell like sheets of steel. Jungle humidity suffocated. Japanese snipers lurked in treetops, invisible but deadly. The Marines dug foxholes that filled with water. Food ran low. Disease ran rampant. And through all of it, the Code Talkers sat with radios pressed to their ears, transmitting messages non-stop. Move the right flank. Supply is arriving at dawn. Enemy approaching from the ridge. They spoke in Navajo, translating into code at lightning speed, sending life or death information to commanders who relied on their clarity and precision. They transmitted under fire, under stress, under exhaustion so deep it blurred vision. But their messages were flawless. On Guadalcanal, commanders realized something astonishing. For the first time, the enemy wasn't listening. The Japanese intercepted every transmission, but they could not understand a single word. The Navajo spoke faster than bullets could fly, and the enemy remained blind. A new weapon in the Pacific. As the war spread to Bougainville, Peleliu, and Cape Gloucester, the Code Talkers became legendary among those who depended on them. Marines whispered about them in admiration. They talk faster than we can think. Those Navajo boys never get a message wrong. Give them a radio and they'll win you a battle. On the beaches of Bougainville, one Code Talker team relayed over 100 messages in 24 hours, without stopping, without sleeping, without a single error. Their hands shook. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat. Their eyes burned from lack of sleep. But the code held. The messages were perfect, and the battle turned. The machine guns jammed. The typewriters froze. But the Navajo voices, they never faltered. Lightning in the heart of hell, Iwo Jima. Nothing prepared them for Iwo Jima. The island was a volcanic fortress, black sand that swallowed boots, ridges crawling with hidden bunkers, skies filled with smoke so thick it tasted like burning metal. Marines died in waves. Commanders struggled to coordinate any movement. Chaos reigned. And into this chaos came the Code Talkers. With radios strapped to their backs, they followed the front lines, crawling across beaches under machine gun fire, ducking mortars, moving through ash and blood. For 48 hours, they transmitted without pause. Over 800 messages. No mistakes. Major Howard Connor later said, "Without the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." He meant it. On that island, where thousands fell, the Code Talkers became the nerve system of the invasion, carrying orders, calling airstrikes, coordinating tank movements, guiding reinforcements. Their speed carved pathways through chaos. Every heartbeat mattered. Every second saved a life. Every message brought victory closer. The burden of silence. When the war ended, the Code Talkers expected, perhaps quietly, perhaps humbly, some recognition. After all, they had carried the war on their shoulders. Their code had remained unbroken. Their speed had shaped history. But instead of medals or newspaper headlines, they received instructions. The code remains classified. Tell no one. Not their families, not their friends, not even other veterans. They returned home to reservations struggling with poverty, unemployment, and lack of resources. Some were welcomed warmly. Others faced the same discrimination they had known before the war. And yet, they kept the secret. For decades. Their silence became another form of service, another measure of discipline, loyalty, and honor. The world finally hears their voices. In 1968, the code was finally declassified. Slowly, the truth emerged. Historians were stunned. Military analysts were speechless. Cryptographers called the Navajo Code the most successful, unbreakable code in modern warfare. The nation listened, at last, to the story of the young Navajo Marines who had turned their language into a weapon faster and more accurate than any machine. The warriors who had become living communication lines. The lightning-fast messengers who had shaped the Pacific War. In 2001, President George W. Bush honored the original 29 Code Talkers with Congressional Gold Medals. Their hands, once calloused from radios and rifles, now held symbols of a gratitude long overdue. Families wept. Former Marines saluted. Elders spoke blessings in Navajo. The nation finally understood what had always been true. Victory in the Pacific had traveled through Navajo voices. Legacy of the Lightning Messengers. Today, the Code Talkers are remembered as more than military heroes. They are symbols of resilience, identity, and survival. Their speed was unmatched. Their accuracy was flawless. Their courage was woven into every message they sent. They proved that a language once mocked and suppressed could become the strongest shield in the world's most brutal war. And they showed that warriors do not always fight with swords or guns. Sometimes they fight with words, with memory, with a heartbeat measured against the roar of battle. They fought with lightning, and lightning carried the day.
Baptism by fire on the beaches of Guadalcanal. Their first real test, decoding chaos amid gunfire, smoke, and the thunder of a war far from home. War usually announces itself long before a soldier hears the first gunshot. But for the young Navajo Marines stepping onto the shores of Guadalcanal, war arrived in a single overwhelming instant. A wall of heat, smoke, and metal, roaring toward them as if the entire island had awakened hungry. This was their baptism by fire. This was the moment the Code Talkers realized that everything they had trained for, every drill, every coded word, every heartbeat, was about to be tested in a crucible far from the deserts and canyons of home. The landing crafts rattled violently as they approached shore. Inside, the Navajo Marines clutched their radios, their fingers trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline. They had been trained for pressure. They had practiced sending and receiving coded messages under simulated explosions, timed drills, and shouting instructors. But nothing compared to the thunder that greeted them when the ramp dropped. Machine guns ripped through the humid air. Mortars exploded in pillars of black sand. Shrapnel sang like metal hawks overhead. Marines sprinted for cover, stumbling through waves tinted red. Smoke stung the eyes and throat, making the world blur into chaos. And in the middle of that nightmare, the Navajo Marines had one mission: get the radio working. Start transmitting. Don't make a mistake. Don't slow down. They moved with purpose, hugging the ground as they crawled to a patch of broken palm trees. A young Navajo Marine named Thomas Begay threw himself behind a jagged coral ridge and set up the radio antenna. His partner, John Chishili, already had his notepad out, though he knew he wouldn't need it. The code lived entirely in his mind. "Ready?" John shouted over the artillery. Thomas nodded. Their training clicked into place. The fear disappeared. The world shrank to a series of sounds, static, shouted coordinates, Navajo syllables, English translations. They became exactly what the Marines needed: a communication lifeline under fire. The first message arrived within seconds. Enemy moving along the East Ridge. Request air support. Thomas translated it instantly into Navajo code, words that flowed like water, fast and clear. John relayed the message through the radio, his voice steady even as bullets sliced leaves inches above his head. Within minutes, American aircraft responded, diving low over the ridge and forcing the enemy back into the jungle. Marines who thought they were about to be overrun suddenly found breathing room. The Code Talkers didn't celebrate. They moved to the next message, and the next, and the next. Every second mattered. The island was alive with danger. Japanese snipers hid in treetops. Zero fighters screamed overhead. The stench of burning fuel mixed with seawater and blood. But the Navajo voices cut through it all like lightning. As the day dragged on, the fighting only intensified. Marines pushed inland, sweating through their uniforms as they hacked through vines and muddy ravines. The Code Talkers followed closely, carrying radios that felt heavier with every step. Their job was not glamorous. They didn't charge pillboxes, they didn't clear trenches with grenades. But without them, none of those attacks could be safely coordinated. By midday, they were transmitting orders for artillery positions, reporting enemy movements, and relaying urgent requests for ammunition. Their speed astonished officers. In the time it took a machine to encode one message, the Code Talkers had sent 3. "Those Navajo boys," one lieutenant muttered in disbelief. "They're faster than the damned enemy can blink." Night fell over Guadalcanal like a suffocating blanket. Jungle insects screamed, the humidity thickened, but the enemy didn't rest, and neither could the Code Talkers. Japanese forces began a coordinated night assault, using the darkness to mask their movements. Flares burst overhead, casting ghostly light on the tangled battlefield. The radio crackled non-stop. "Left flank breached! Navajo, send it!" Thomas's fingers shook from exhaustion. John's voice was hoarse from hours of rapid transmission. Sweat dripped down their faces and mixed with the grit caked on their skin. Still they worked. Still the messages flowed. Still they kept the battle alive. During one frantic moment, artillery officers needed an immediate correction. Enemy troops were advancing faster than expected. A single wrong digit could have sent shells falling onto their own Marines. Thomas inhaled sharply, blocking out the chaos. He pictured the Navajo symbols in his mind: hawk,
horse, trough, yucca plant, each representing a letter, a concept, a fragment of the code. He transmitted with precision honed through months of relentless training. The correction was perfect. Moments later, American artillery lit up the jungle, halting the enemy's advance just in time. "That saved the regiment," an officer whispered. Hours blurred together as dawn crept across the treetops. Exhaustion weighed heavily on the code talkers, but they kept working. Their radio packs felt like anchors. Their eyes burned from smoke. Their throats were raw from shouting over explosions. But they never slowed. They never faltered. By the end of the second day, the Marines realized something extraordinary. Every message the code talkers sent was flawless. Not a single error, not a single delay. And the enemy, despite intercepting transmission after transmission, remained utterly confused. One Japanese cryptographer later admitted that they had no idea what language they were hearing. He said, "It sounded like water running over rocks. Impossible to follow, impossible to break." As the battle for Guadalcanal raged into weeks, the code talkers continued to prove their worth. They transmitted messages during surprise ambushes, coordinated rescue missions, and guided ammunition drops through monsoon storms.
Everywhere they went, Marines felt a surge of confidence. When a code talker was nearby, communication was secure, instant, reliable. Commanders stopped referring to them as radio men. They began calling them something else entirely. Our lifelines, our lightning messengers, our secret weapon. The Navajo Marines, who had grown up in distant deserts, whose ancestors had endured the long walk and cultural suppression, now stood at the heart of America's fight in the Pacific. Their language, once punished in schoolhouses, had become the strongest shield on the battlefield. By the time the Guadalcanal campaign ended, the U.S. military understood the full weight of what the code talkers could do. Their performance had been nothing short of miraculous. They had entered the war young, untested, and far from home. They emerged as indispensable soldiers whose courage under fire shaped the future of the Pacific campaign. Guadalcanal was their baptism by fire, a trial that forged them into legends, even though the world would not know their names for decades. They didn't brag. They didn't seek attention. They simply did their duty, with speed, with precision, and with a fierce loyalty rooted in the Navajo spirit. Their voices had guided Marines through hell. Their words had turned chaos into strategy. Their code had remained unbroken. And in the end, the thunder of war could not silence the language that carried America to its first major victory in the Pacific.
Voices carrying victory through the jungle. Messages raced through tangled terrain, guiding troops, redirecting airstrikes, and saving lives one transmission at a time. The jungle did not welcome them. It swallowed them. Heat pressed from every direction. Vines twisted like serpents. Insects screamed loud enough to drown thought. And somewhere inside that choking green maze, the enemy moved with ghost-like silence, striking from shadows, disappearing before the Marines could blink. But amid the chaos, there was one sound the jungle could not silence: the steady, rapid-fire transmissions of the Navajo Code Talkers. Their voices carried through static and gunfire alike, slicing through confusion with the precision of a surgeon's blade. In a place where visibility was measured in inches and danger lurked behind every leaf, these young Marines became the heartbeat of every operation. This is how victory traveled. Not on maps, not through generals, but through the unstoppable voices of men, speaking a language the enemy could never break. A jungle that wanted them dead. When the Marines pushed deeper into Solomon Islands terrain during the Pacific Campaign, they quickly realized that the battle here wasn't just against the Japanese, it was against the jungle itself. The air was so thick with humidity that radios steamed. The ground sucked at boots like quicksand. Mosquitoes bit through uniforms, and the canopy turned daylight into a permanent green twilight. Each step forward felt like stepping into a trap. Patrols never knew whether the next ridge held an enemy squad or a booby-trapped ravine. But communication? That was the real nightmare. Radio signals crackled, distorted by the foliage. Machines overheated. Wires snapped. Messages got lost in translation, misunderstood or intercepted. American troops desperately needed a communication system that could move fast, cut through confusion, and remain absolutely secure. And that's when the Code Talkers stepped forward. Quiet, focused, unwavering. Lightning in human form. Private Raymond Nez and Corporal Frank Tosi were among the Code Talkers assigned to a Marine battalion pushing through Bougainville's dense undergrowth. Their job? Stay close to the command group, keep the radio dry, and deliver messages instantly, no matter what. Their greatest weapon wasn't firepower, it was memory. Hundreds of Navajo code terms lived inside their minds, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. No notebooks, no manuals, no cipher wheels, just training, instinct, and trust. Even with bullets stitching the trees around them, their voices never wavered. When the battalion commander needed artillery support, Nez translated coordinates into Navajo within seconds. Tzosi relayed the encoded message and received confirmation almost immediately. Artillery incoming! Moments later, American guns thundered from miles away, shells tearing into a Japanese stronghold that had pinned Marines for hours. The jungle shook, the enemy line broke, and Marines pushed forward, saved by a message carried at the speed of breath. When air support hangs by a syllable. Days later, the unit became trapped. Dense brush blocked their path, and Japanese fighters flanked from both sides. Gunfire echoed through the trees in unpredictable bursts. The radios sputtered, static hissed, the signal faded. For a terrifying minute, it seemed like they were cut off entirely. Then, a brief, fragile window of connection flickered alive. "Call air support, now!" The commander shouted, hoarse. Nez grabbed the receiver, forcing clarity through the static. Above them, pilots circled, searching for a target they could barely see through the jungle canopy. One wrong coordinate would mean friendly fire, a danger the Marines understood too well. Nez inhaled deeply. His training sharpened every nerve. He spoke rapidly in Navajo, sending a coded message that flew from the jungle floor to the sky in a matter of seconds. Diet sea tsa, achin, tsa, ga. Buzzard, nose, wood, rabbit. Fighter bombers peeled off formation, diving through the cloud cover like silver hawks. The bombs fell with devastating accuracy, right on the enemy positions, not on the Marines. The battalion survived because one Navajo Marine spoke faster than fear. Running messages on the move. The jungle never allowed rest. Every hour brought new ambushes, new obstacles, new commands. And the Code Talkers had to move constantly with their units, wading through rivers waist deep, climbing ridges slick with mud, slipping past snake-infested roots. Their radios weighed nearly 50 pounds when fully packed. Still, they ran. Messages had to travel even when legs trembled and lungs burned. Silence was death. Hesitation was worse. One night, during a heavy rainstorm, the Marines prepared for a coordinated assault on a Japanese bunker complex. The plan was complex: mortar teams on one ridge, rifle squads circling another, engineers setting explosives along a trench line. But thick rain muffled all sound. Visibility dropped to nothing. Without perfect communication, the attack risked collapsing into confusion. The commander turned to his Code Talker team. "Get this right," he whispered. "All of our lives depend on it." Nez relayed 6 long-coded messages in under 30 seconds each, guiding units in total darkness, adjusting timing, calling for flares, and confirming positions. The attack launched perfectly synchronized. When dawn broke, the Marines had taken the ridge. The Code Talkers had carried victory through the jungle, one breath, one word, one heartbeat at a time.
The jungle that failed to break them. The Japanese tried everything to crack American codes: interception, analysis, even recording Navajo transmissions and replaying them backward. Nothing worked. To the enemies hiding in the jungle, Navajo sounded like a river flowing over stones, impossible to isolate or decode. Meanwhile, the Code Talkers kept moving. They dodged snipers. They crawled through mud. They sent messages while soaked, hungry, exhausted, and feverish. But their code never faltered. Marine units relied on them so heavily that some commanders requested Navajo teams by name for every mission. The trust was absolute. If a Code Talker sent it, it was right. If a Code Talker said it, it was true. If a Code Talker called it in, survival increased. Their voices carried more than information. They carried hope. One transmission, 100 lives. The most dramatic moment came during a river crossing. A Marine platoon attempted to ford a shallow bend, but came under intense fire from an entrenched Japanese machine gun nest. Pinned, exposed, and unable to move, they radioed for help. Nez knelt behind a fallen log, bullets thudding inches away. The radio hissed, water splashed, someone screamed. He transmitted a coded message requesting immediate mortar fire, danger close. If he got the coordinates wrong by even a tiny margin, the mortars would land on the Marines. His heart beat like a drum, his breath steadied. He spoke in Navajo with absolute clarity. 30 seconds later, mortars slammed into the far bank. The enemy fell silent. The Marines crossed safely. The platoon commander placed a hand on Nez's shoulder afterward and said quietly, "You didn't just send a message tonight. You saved every man here." A legacy that outran the jungle. When the campaign finally ended, the Marines emerged battered, thinner, and forever changed. Many had lost friends. Many carried wounds that would never fully heal. But every surviving Marine understood one truth. They had made it out because someone carried their fate through the jungle on a radio line, spoken in a language older than the war itself. The Code Talkers didn't ask for praise. They didn't seek recognition. They simply packed their radios, cleaned their rifles, and prepared for the next island, the next jungle, the next battle where their voices would again guide victory. Their transmissions, fast, flawless, unbreakable, had become the lifeblood of the Pacific War. And long after the battles ended, the story remained. In the darkest jungle, where maps failed and machines faltered, it was the Navajo voices that lit the path forward.
When every word could mean life or death. Under constant threat, Code Talkers protected not just the message, but the mission itself, at any cost. The first bullet snapped past his ear before he even finished the sentence. Enemy armor advancing, North Ridge, request immediate artillery. Private First Class Nez didn't flinch. His thumb pressed the radio key, his voice steady as he sent the Navajo-coded message back through the headset. Around him, Marines dove into the mud,
Shells erupted in geysers of dirt, and the jungle rattled with machine gun fire. But Nez's voice flowed like water, calm, clipped, flawless. On that humid, suffocating afternoon on Bougainville, one truth became painfully clear. For the Navajo Code Talkers, every word was a battlefield weapon, and one mistake could mean an entire platoon wiped out. This was the war few Americans ever saw, the war fought in whispers. The weight of a message. From the moment the Code Talkers hit the front lines, they knew their role wasn't simply to communicate. They were responsible for the accuracy of artillery coordinates, troop movements, supply routes, and emergency evacuations. A single mispronounced syllable in Navajo could turn a strike zone into friendly fire. Navajo was tonal, layered with meaning, and dangerous to wield under pressure. A small shift in emphasis could turn tank, che daigihi, into tortoise, chosh, or battalion into herd. In the chaos of battle, precision wasn't optional, it was survival. And the enemy, they were listening. The enemy's intelligence units tracked every radio transmission. They recorded hours of the Navajo messages, rewound them, slowed them, played them backward, and fed them to linguists trained in multiple indigenous languages. None succeeded. Still, this did not comfort the Navajo Code Talkers on the front lines. The danger was never just interception. It was time. When officers yelled for air support, Code Talkers had to deliver in seconds, under fire, while kneeling in flooded foxholes or sprinting between shell craters with radio gear strapped to their backs. Every message was a countdown. Every word carried lives inside it. Never allowed to fall into enemy hands. One of the darkest realities the Code Talkers never mentioned, not even years after the war, was the silent shadow trailing them. Each Code Talker had an assigned Marine bodyguard, not to protect them, but to prevent them from being captured alive. If a Code Talker fell into Japanese hands, the entire Pacific Code system would collapse. Officers feared the Japanese might torture them, force them to speak, or break them psychologically. The orders were brutally clear. If capture appears likely, do not let the Code Talker fall into enemy hands, at any cost. Many bodyguards admitted decades later they lived with that weight every day. And the Code Talkers, quiet, disciplined, observant, understood far more than they let on. They knew the price. And yet, they kept sending messages.
The night the message saved an entire Marine regiment. On the island of Peleliu, one of the most brutal battlegrounds of the war, Code Talker Thomas Begay found himself in the center of a nightmare. It was 2:14 a.m. Moonlight filtered through shredded palms. Japanese forces launched a sudden counterattack, breaking through the southern perimeter and pushing straight toward a regiment of sleeping Marines. If they succeeded, thousands would die before dawn. Begay fired up the radio, heart pounding. Enemy rushing your position. Move to defensive line now. Coordinate grid following. He transmitted the coded Navajo message faster than anyone had ever heard him speak. Air support scrambled. Marines were shaken awake as Japanese soldiers began overrunning foxholes. Begay kept sending new positions, new threats, new coordinates. His voice stable even as explosions shook the earth and shrapnel ripped through the sandbags beside him. At 2:38 a.m., American dive bombers arrived. They unleashed a wall of fire that forced the Japanese back and prevented what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough. After the battle, a Marine lieutenant approached Begay. "How'd you stay so calm?" he asked, still shaking. Begay only shrugged. "If my voice shakes, men die."
trust built in the firestorm. Early in the war, many officers doubted the Code Talkers. They questioned the strange language, the unusual system, the unorthodox training. Some even feared they couldn't handle pressure. But after Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, after seeing Code Talkers transmit hundreds of messages with 0 errors, Marines became fierce defenders of these quiet warriors. On Iwo Jima alone, the Code Talkers sent more than 800 flawless messages in the first 48 hours of fighting. Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." That wasn't a metaphor. It was battlefield fact. The Code Talkers had become indispensable. But with trust came responsibility and danger. The moments they never told their families. Many Code Talkers went home carrying memories carved deep into their bones. They remembered holding radios while wounded Marines screamed around them. They remembered sending final evacuation messages for men who never made it to the beach. They remembered lying shoulder to shoulder in black volcanic sand, transmitting coordinates while bullets rained like steel hail. And they remembered the moments when the radio stayed silent, when they had to wait for confirmation as seconds crawled like hours. Because sometimes the enemy moved faster than the message. Sometimes even flawless code couldn't save everyone. The Code Talkers carried the guilt of those moments quietly, privately, for decades. Bound by secrecy oaths, they couldn't explain their nightmares, couldn't describe the weight they held, couldn't tell their children why they woke up sweating. Only after 1968, when the program was finally declassified, could they begin to speak. By then, many had already taken their stories to the grave. A language once forced into silence became the voice of survival. What made the Code Talkers' courage even more extraordinary was where they came from. Many had grown up in boarding schools where they were punished for speaking Navajo. Soap in the mouth, beatings, isolation, loss of identity. Yet in the Pacific, that same language became the most powerful tool in America's arsenal. The irony wasn't lost on them or on history. In the same voice elders once told creation stories and sing blessings, these young Marines now sent battlefield orders that saved American lives. In the same tones used during ceremonies back home, they guided airstrikes, redirected tanks, evacuated wounded units, and coordinated entire offensives. Their ancestors had spoken Navajo for centuries. Now those words echoed across oceans, reshaping the war itself. The unspoken legacy of men who spoke through fire. The Code Talkers rarely called themselves heroes. Most refused to boast or exaggerate. Some never even attended veteran reunions. But those who served beside them remembered. They remembered how in the darkest hours, when radios jammed and commanders panicked, the Code Talkers spoke with unshakable clarity. They remembered how these young men, some only 17 or 18 years old, stood firm while seasoned soldiers broke down. They remembered the quiet confidence, the steady tone, the precision. They remembered that the Navajo voice carried farther than fear. And they understood that the war might not have been won without them. The final word, courage written in syllables of stone. Every Code Talker knew the truth. Their language wasn't just communication. It was duty. It was identity. It was the shield of thousands. It was the blade that cut through chaos. It was life itself. And so, under the roar of artillery and the screams of the wounded, they kept speaking, word after word, message after message, until the war finally ended. In the end, the Japanese never broke the code. Not once, not ever.
because it wasn't just code. It was culture. It was sacrifice. It was the calm heartbeat of warriors who knew that every syllable mattered. And on those islands, far from home, under skies lit by fire, they protected not only the message, but the mission and the lives of countless Marines who never knew the names of the men who saved them.
A secret so valuable they guarded it even among allies. Their radios hummed with classified whispers. Even fellow Marines never knew the full truth of what they heard. The first time Corporal Kiyazi realized just how dangerous his mission truly was, he wasn't facing a Japanese soldier. He was staring down the barrel of an American rifle. It was midnight on Guam. Tropical rain hammered the palm leaves. A patrol returning to camp mistook him for an infiltrator, the glow of his radio illuminating only his silhouette. "Identify yourself!" the Marine barked. Key raised his hand slowly, voice steady. "Code Talker," he said. The Marine lowered his weapon, embarrassed and shaken. "Sorry. They told us you boys operate alone, but no one ever said why." Key only nodded, because that was the rule. A rule thicker than loyalty, stronger than rank, heavier than the weight of their steel radios. Trust no one with the code, not even your own brothers in uniform. It was a secret so precious that they guarded it more fiercely than their own lives. The mission hidden in plain sight. By the time the Navajo Code Talkers deployed across the Pacific, rumors followed them everywhere. Some Marines thought they were scouts. Others assumed they were interpreters. A few believed, incorrectly, that they were Japanese defectors taught to fight against their homeland. Key heard every theory. He was ordered to confirm none of them. Because the truth was simple, terrifying, and too valuable to share. The fate of entire Marine divisions depended on their voices. The Navajo Code was not merely classified communication. It was the backbone of every major U.S. offensive, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. If even one part of the code leaked, Japan would adapt within days. If a code talker was captured, the Pacific strategy could collapse overnight. Not even generals had full access to how the system worked. The fewer who knew the truth, the safer the Marines fighting on the ground. Words wrapped in layers of secrecy. Each message the code talkers sent carried 3 layers of protection. The Navajo language itself, an unwritten, complex tonal language Japanese cryptographers could not decode. The coded Navajo vocabulary. The word for turtle meant tank. The word for hummingbird meant fighter plane. The word for iron fish meant submarine. And the speed of translation which machines of the era could not match. A code talker could encrypt and transmit in 20 seconds what machines took 30 minutes. But the secrecy went beyond language. They were forbidden from writing the code down, teaching it to others, explaining it to officers, discussing operations, revealing radio positions, mentioning their assignment to anyone, even under fire. The code talkers were shadows in daylight, visible yet untouchable. The bodyguards who knew too much. Every code talker was assigned a personal bodyguard. Officially, the bodyguards were there for protection. Unofficially, they carried a darker responsibility. If capture was imminent, they were instructed to kill the code talker. Key knew this. All the men knew it. They never spoke of it, not even decades later. The Japanese were infamous for targeting radio men first. If they captured a code talker, they could extract the entire U.S. battle plan from a single voice. Better to die than risk that. Key's bodyguard, Private Dawson, a farm boy from Texas, once admitted in a whisper, "I hope I never have to follow those orders. But if the moment comes, I'll do what I have to. Key didn't blame him. He only said, Nahohidi, do what's right. Allies who knew only the echoes. Even among their own units, the code talkers were instructed to speak softly, encrypt quickly, and shut down radios instantly if approached. This secrecy created tension. Some Marines grew suspicious. Others grew protective. Many simply felt excluded, confused by the hush-hush orders surrounding the code talkers. Why can't you tell us what you're sending? Why can't we know the code? Why do officers pull you out before every attack? Key had answers. He could share none of them. A lieutenant once pressed him. Corporal, what's so special about your transmissions? Key stared straight ahead. With respect, sir, classified. The lieutenant shook his head, muttering as he walked away. Key remained silent. If the code was to remain unbreakable, it had to remain invisible, even to allies. A night of fire and a message that changed everything. The most terrifying moment of Key's service came on Saipan. It was 3:10 a.m. The sky glowed red with artillery bursts. Japanese forces had infiltrated the ridge above the American line, preparing a banzai charge aimed at the command post. If they succeeded, they would wipe out headquarters, radios, and officers, cutting the division's brain from its body. Key received the intel moments before the attack began. He grabbed the handset. Enemy preparing mass charge, North Ridge, send immediate reinforcements, coordinates following. Dawson crouched beside him, rifle ready. Japanese scouts crept closer. Bullets shredded palm branches over Key's head. He kept transmitting, voice level, ignoring the sand spraying his face. His radio hummed with static. Then, the reply came. Message received. Hold your position. Minutes later, Marines stormed the ridge, stopping the attack before it toppled the entire line. Dozens of lives, maybe hundreds, were saved by one transmission. When the battle ended, the lieutenant who once questioned Key approached him, face pale. I don't know what you said, but I know this. Whatever it was, it worked. Key simply nodded. That was enough. The code they couldn't see became the lifeline they trusted. Over time, Marines began to accept the secrecy. They didn't understand the code, but they trusted the men who carried it. They trusted the calmness under fire. They trusted the flawless accuracy. They trusted the speed no machine could match. They trusted the strange, musical language that seemed to flow even through chaos. Key remembered the moment everything changed. It was during a brutal fight on Pelaleo. Their unit was pinned down, ammo low, stretcher bearers overwhelmed. A sergeant yelled, "Get the code talker up here." Key sprinted forward, radio on his back. The sergeant didn't ask what the message meant, didn't ask how Key encoded the message, didn't ask why Navajo words could move artillery faster than English. He simply waited. When Key finished transmitting, the sergeant clapped his shoulder. Good. If you said it, that's enough for me. The trust was complete. The secret that outlived the war. When the war ended, the code talkers expected to return home and finally share what they had done. But the government had other plans. They were ordered. The code remains classified. Do not speak of your role. Not to your wives, not to your families, not to anyone. For the next 24 years, they carried their stories in silence, kept medals in drawers, avoided questions, buried memories of battles, transmissions, and near-death encounters. The Marines they fought beside had no idea what the Navajo had truly accomplished. America would not learn the truth until the program was declassified in 1968. By then, many code talkers had already passed away, never recognized, never thanked.
A legacy built in silence, protected in shadows. The Navajo Code Talkers were more than radio men, more than warriors, more than translators. They were guardians of the most secure communication system in military history. A code so perfect it was never broken. A secret so valuable it was hidden even from allies. A mission so critical it shaped the outcome of the Pacific War. And through it all, they remained quiet protectors, speaking only when necessary, transmitting only what mattered, and carrying a weight heavier than any rifle. In a war of noise, explosions, screams, gunfire, they fought with silence, precision, and unwavering loyalty. Because they understood something others never had to. A single word could win a battle. A single mistake could end 1,000 lives. And some secrets were worth guarding with everything they had.
Silence after the guns went quiet. Returning home as unsung heroes, bound by oath, unable to tell even family how many battles their voices helped win. The day Private Nathan Chi stepped off the troop train in New Mexico, the wind carried the familiar scent of sagebrush and red earth. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, he felt an emptiness, strange, heavy, and silent, settling on his shoulders like the desert dusk. Neighbors cheered for the returning soldiers. Flags waved. Mothers cried. But Nathan noticed something immediately. No one was cheering for the Code Talkers. Not because they didn't want to, but because no one knew what they had done. He had helped win battles thousands of miles across the Pacific. He had sent messages under fire that saved entire units. He had transmitted coordinates that shifted the course of invasions. He had spoken a language the enemy could never crack. Yet he could not tell a single soul, not even his mother. The greatest burden he carried back from the war was not trauma or injury. It was silence. A hero with no story to tell. When Nathan walked into his family's small hogan, his younger sister rushed to him, grabbing his uniform sleeve. "Did you see Japan? Did you fire your rifle? Were you scared?" He forced a small smile. "I carried a radio," he said simply. Not a lie, just not the whole truth. His mother, eyes shining in pride, touched the medal pinned near his chest. "What is this one for?" Nathan hesitated. He couldn't tell her it represented months of transmitting critical messages in the deadliest battles of the Pacific. He couldn't tell her he sent the very words that coordinated the assault on Iwo Jima's volcano ridge. He couldn't tell her he'd watch Marines fall all around him while he kept speaking, voice calm, heart racing, hands steady on the transmitter. So he only whispered, "For doing my job." Her mother nodded, not knowing that her son had been part of the most secure communication network in military history, one that remained buried under layers of secrecy. The oath that followed them home. Before leaving the Marine Corps, every Navajo Code Talker signed an order stamped in red, classified, "Do not discuss." Not with friends, not with reporters, not with family, not even with fellow veterans. The code might be needed again, they said. The Cold War was beginning. The government wasn't taking chances. Their silence was now service. Nathan had survived ambushes on Bougainville, artillery storms on Peleliu, and the hellish sands of Iwo Jima, but this was different. This silence stalked him in the quiet hours of the night, when he lay awake, listening to the desert winds scraping along the hogan walls. He longed to talk, to release it, to share the truth that burned inside him.
but he said nothing. Life rebuilt with quiet determination. Back on the reservation, the world moved slower. Days were filled with sheep herding, fence repair, ceremonies, and family gatherings. Nathan tried to settle in, but the rhythm felt foreign after years of jungle warfare. At gatherings, people asked veterans to share stories. Nathan listened to others talk about firefights, foxholes, and narrow escapes. When it was his turn, he simply said, "I was a radio operator." The men nodded politely, but in their eyes he saw it. They thought he was just a support clerk, not a fighter, not a frontline Marine, not a hero. Nathan didn't correct them. He had been trained not to. The weight of unsung valor. Sometimes late at night, he would take out his helmet and run his fingers along the dents left by shrapnel. He remembered the sound of rain pounding on his radio pack in the jungles of Guam. He remembered the voice of his sergeant yelling, "Chi, we need that message now!" He remembered speaking rapidly in Navajo, sending words that meant life or death. And he remembered the fear, not of dying, but of failing, of letting even one syllable slip, of costing other Marines their lives. That fear had followed him home as silently as his shadow. But he could share none of this. A community that understood without words. What saved him from sinking into despair was something unexpected, the presence of other code talkers. They rarely discussed the war directly, not the details, not the missions, not the battles, but they understood each other's silences. When they sat around a fire at night, listening to crackling embers and coyote howls, the pauses between their conversations carried more truth than words ever could. A nod, a glance, a quiet breath. These were their confessions, their shared memories, their unspoken brotherhood. On those nights, Nathan did not feel alone. The long wait for the world to hear the truth. Years turned into decades. Nathan married, raised children, and worked tirelessly on the reservation. But the war never fully left him. Occasionally, a newspaper would run a brief story about mysterious code talkers. No names, no details, just speculation. He clipped each article, storing them in a shoebox under his bed. He waited, patiently, respectfully, for the day the truth could finally be spoken. And then, in 1968, 24 years after he returned home, the military declassified the program. For the first time, he held the piece of paper in his hands that said he could finally speak. Nathan sat with it for a long time. Then he whispered to himself, "It's time." The voices finally heard. When his family gathered that evening, Nathan cleared his throat. "I have something to tell you," he said. His children looked up. His wife folded her hands. His mother, now older, slower, tilted her head. Nathan exhaled. "I wasn't just a radio operator. I was a code talker." He explained how Navajo words helped win major battles, how their code had never been broken, how he had spoken messages under fire, guiding aircraft, artillery, and entire divisions. His family listened with wide eyes, tears forming in silence. For the first time in his life, Nathan felt a weight lift from his chest. His mother touched his hand, voice trembling. "We always knew you carried something heavy. Now we understand." The quiet legacy of those who spoke through fire. Nathan Chi was just one of hundreds of Navajo code talkers who returned to quiet homes, quiet jobs, quiet lives, carrying histories the world wasn't allowed to hear. They weren't forgotten. They were hidden by oath, by duty, by necessity. But time has a way of uncovering truth. And today, when historians speak of the Pacific War, when they speak of Iwo Jima, Saipan, Tarawa, Guadalcanal, they speak of the men whose voices traveled through fire. Men like Nathan, men who returned home not with parades or medals, but with silence, a silence that shielded a nation long after the guns went quiet.
The day the nation finally listened, the old warrior never expected a crowd. For most of his life, Samuel Nez had spoken his truth only to mountains, to the fire in his hogan, and to the silence that settled over Navajo land at dusk. He had mailed no letters describing the battles. He had never once corrected a history book that forgot to mention him. He had carried an unbroken oath for decades, an oath that once protected a nation and later concealed his own part in shaping it. But on a warm July morning in Washington, D.C., he stepped off the bus and found the silence replaced by applause. Hundreds, maybe thousands, stood waiting. Camera shutters clicked, flags rippled, and hanging above the stage were words he never thought he would live to see, honoring the Navajo Code Talkers. Samuel's hands trembled, not from age, but from the overwhelming fact that America was finally ready to listen. For so long their voices had been used only in war. Their native tongue, once punished, once suppressed in boarding schools, had carried the most vital messages across the Pacific. In the jungles of Bougainville, on the black sands of Iwo Jima, on ships rocked by enemy fire, their words had moved faster than decoded machines, clearer than static, and stronger than fear. Yet when the survivors came home, they returned as ghosts of a story the nation never read. Samuel remembered the day he received his discharge papers in 1945. The officer shook his hand, thanked him for his service, and then lowered his voice. "Your work is classified. You will not speak of it, not even to family." It felt like a second war, one fought inside his own chest. His mother asked what he had done in the Marines. His brothers teased him for staying quiet. Children at school wanted to know if he'd been afraid. He simply smiled and said, "I did what I was told." But what he had done could have filled whole bookshelves. He had sent coordinates that saved trapped Marines. He had directed airstrikes through smoke so thick it swallowed daylight. He had heard men scream, guns roar, aircraft dive, and yet his voice had remained steady, measured, faster than the fear running through him. Through it all, he spoke Navajo, a language the world once tried to erase and now depended on for survival. The ceremony stage stretched across the Capitol lawn, framed by banners in red and gold. The smell of summer grass and distant city smog blended strangely with his memories of sulfur, seawater, and burning oil from ships that once lit the night sky like torches. He blinked them away as a Marine captain escorted him and other aging code talkers toward their seats of honor. Some leaned on canes, some were pushed in wheelchairs, some walked straight-backed, still carrying the quiet pride of warriors who had once outrun death in the thickest nights of the Pacific. A woman in the crowd held up a poster with a photo of her grandfather, also a code talker, who had passed away long before recognition arrived. Samuel nodded to her gently, acknowledging the weight of all the voices that never made it home. The ceremony began with a familiar sound, drums, not military drums, Navajo ceremonial drums, deep, steady, resonant, echoing across the lawn like thunder rolling across desert mesas. It was the first time he had ever heard his culture honored in the heart of America's capital. When the president stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. He spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of a language that saved lives. But then he said something Samuel had waited a lifetime to hear. The Navajo language was America's shield, and the men who carried it into battle are among our greatest heroes. The word struck Samuel harder than any explosion he had endured in war. He had always known the truth, but hearing the nation say it after so many years of silence felt like a burden lifting off generations. Medals were presented one by one. Hands shook. Photographs flashed. Some code talkers wiped tears discreetly behind their sunglasses. When Samuel's name was called, Corporal Samuel Nez, United States Marine Corps, he rose slowly, steadying his breath. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, but his thoughts drifted far from D.C. He was back in a foxhole on Guadalcanal, rain pounding like gravel. Back on Iwo Jima, sending a message that changed the tide of the battle within minutes. Back with his buddy Thomas, who had been hit by shrapnel, but insisted Samuel keep transmitting because the message mattered more than either of their lives. Thomas never made it home. Samuel whispered his name under his breath as he accepted the medal. The applause washed over him like ocean surf. For the first time he allowed himself to feel proud, not secretly, not quietly, but openly, in front of a nation that finally understood. When the ceremony ended, reporters rushed forward with microphones. "Sir, how does it feel? What was your most dangerous mission? How did you keep the code secure?" Samuel only smiled. "All of us did our part," he said carefully. "The code was our language. It was given to us by our ancestors. We just used it to protect the men beside us." Then he paused, looking across the crowd, the flags, the Capitol rising in the background. "For a long time nobody knew what we did, but today feels like homecoming." A young Navajo Marine approached him, barely 20, sharp uniform, eyes bright with respect. "Sir, my grandfather told me about you. Because of what you men did, I joined the Corps." Samuel gripped the young man's hand, feeling the lineage pass between them like a current. "Then carry yourself with honor," he said simply. "That's all any warrior can do." As the sun lowered behind the Capitol dome, the crowd slowly dispersed. Samuel looked at the medal in his hand, its weight warm from the day's heat. He thought of the years when he had no proof of what he had done, the years when silence was his only uniform. But now the silence had finally lifted. For the first time, the story belonged not just to the men who lived it, but to the nation their voices helped save. And as Samuel boarded the bus home, he felt light, lighter than he ever had before, because he knew this time America would not forget. At last, the country had listened, and the echoes of their words would carry on forever.